Okay, welcome everyone to my continuation of what are my favorite theorems, my very biased collection as usual. Today I would like to tell you about my failure to think about knots in three space, or strictly speaking, I would like to tell you about what is called a demon knot or hard knot. There are several names for those. We'll see what it is. And well, in my opinion, maybe you guys are too young to remember, but I'm very old. And there was some time where not everything was wireless, and it was always very annoying because the cables always like to tangle and get knotted, and it's super annoying. But in the end, they're all not really knotted. They just look very strange, and it's some non-trivial effort to kind of unknot them, although they're not really knotted in the end. Anyway, so a demon knot is kind of exactly the same in mathematics. It's a knotted object. That sounds very complicated, so let me try again. It's an unknot, so just a circle. So this is called an unknot, just a circle, but it appears in a really, really strange way, and you can't really tell that it's an unknot, and it takes you quite a while to undo it in the sense that you can actually eventually see that it's an unknot. And this, as I said, reminds me of those wired cables or cable type stuff that just likes to tangle. Although, again, it's not really tangled. You can always undo it. But anyway, this was just a huge waffle. So to get started, I would like to recall what knots are. So here are two very nice pictures of knots. This is not strictly speaking a knot. This is a knotted protein. So proteins like to knot themselves. It's kind of really the same idea, but it fits nicely to the picture on the left. So I decided to put it here anyway. So a knot is a closed string in three space. I show you an animation in a second. So it really lives somewhere in R3, and it's just some string. I could try to draw a knot now if I'm not completely silly. This might not be a trivial knot, who knows? Anyway, so as I said, this one would be the trivial knot anyway. So just a string, but it can knot itself if you embed it in three space. And the way you like to study it, and that's kind of the whole point of the video, is exactly as in those two pictures. So you have a knotted molecule or a more mathematical knot, and it's a three-dimensional object, and we kind of don't like three-dimensional objects. That's too high for me to illustrate already. So you look at the shadows of the knot. It's like really you just have some lighting, and the lighting projects it to a plane. The only thing you need to remember is basically which crossing goes over and which crossing goes under, but otherwise that's it. So you have those shadows of the knot. They're called diagrams. I will call them shadows because, well, of this picture here and of this picture. Anyway, so, and as you can already see in this picture, it's always the same knot, right? It's always the same string here, but the shadows are very different. So the crucial problem in knot theory is I give you a shadow, that's kind of the two-dimensional shadow of a knot. And you want to tell what knot it is depending on the shadow, which is, as I said, non-trivial because every knot has infinitely associated shadows. Kind of depends a little bit in what direction you project. And if you're really unlucky, your projection is just extremely bad or whatever. And well, for proteins, you do the same. So sometimes you have a protein and you only see the shadows of the protein, and you would use knot set theory to study proteins, which is certainly a topic for another video. But as you can see, it's really the same. Classical knot theory and studying of proteins is spot on the same. I'm just kidding a bit. Of course, it's slightly different, but there are some nice overlaps. Anyway, so let me show you a knot, and also why I want them to be closed, although this is kind of a weirdish condition in the end. It's not really important. Okay, so this animation produced with Mathematica will create a knot for you, and it will undo the knot because this knot that I'm going to create is not closed. It's just almost closed. And that's really the reason why we would like to have knots being closed, because if they're not closed, so if you just have a string in three space, you can always undo it, which is a bit boring. For all practical purposes, this is completely useless and not important. You can just take a string and hold it with your hands, right? And then it's good. You can knot it anyway, and you can undo. You can't undo the knot. But anyway, mathematically speaking, it should be a closed string. And let's have a look why. So this really builds a highly non-trivial knot, and it stops right before the end. And if you would close it, you would get a knot, right? A string in three space, which is non-trivially knotted. If you don't close it, as you can see, you can immediately undo everything, and it's actually not knotted at all. I hope the setup makes some sense. So the closed condition is a little bit silly, but you need to add it to not collapse everything in the mathematical world to trivial. I think actually the proteins are not really knots in the sense of knots, because they are open and they're not closed. I'm not 100% sure. But as I said, again, in practice, this really doesn't matter. It's just because in mathematics, you need to do it because you can just do very, very strange operation otherwise and undo everything. Anyway, so the whole point here is the notion of a shadow. As I said, strictly speaking, these are called diagrams. I will just call them shadows. Anyway, and a knot can have many, many shadows, and that's kind of the problem of knot theory. And then it comes the Reidemeister move, the Reidemeister theorems, which will be the important notion to define demons or hard knots or whatever you want to call them. And it works as follows. So the Reidemeister theorem is a kind of a beautiful theorem. It says that, well, you have a shadow like this one here, and you have another shadow like this one here, and they're slightly different. So this is a left-handed figure 8 knot, and this is a right-handed one. Or to be completely precise, one of them is a left-handed and one of them is a right-handed. I have no which one. Don't know which one is which. I have no clue. But they're not the same diagrams, as you can see. But they present the same knots. So they're the same shadow, a different shadow of the same knot. And the Reidemeister theorem tells you you can always go from one to the other. So if they are equivalent, and it's actually if and only if you have those easy moves. They're just local moves and they're completely obvious, and everything will be a composition of those. So the first one is something like you can unkink. The second one is something like you can, well, slip like your fingers. One of them is front, one of them is not in front. Well, not in front. One of them is in front, one of them is in the back, and then there's a Reidemeister 3 move. Okay, so this is kind of a very classical theorem, the Reidemeister theorem. So all knots, two shadows, not two knots. Two shadows present the same knot, if and only if they're related by those moves, and the so-called Reidemeister 0 move, which is kind of a stupid isotopy of the diagram, like in the final kind of moves that are done here in this picture. Okay, and you observe the following. Somehow, if you go in this direction, you definitely simplify the knot, right? You unkink. If you go in this direction, you definitely simplify the knot. You get rid of more crossings. And these are kind of the same complexity, the same number of crossings. And now a hard unknot is the following idea. It is an unknot, a diagram, so a shadow of the unknot, that is so complicated that you can't simplify it, although it's still trivial because it's an unknot, right? It's just a circle. It's just a horrible projection of the circle. And what I mean here is the following. I call an unknot diagram, a shadow of the unknot, a demon, if I can't do this move, so Reidemeister 1 in this direction, the simplifying. I can't do a simplifying Reidemeister 2 move, and I can't do a Reidemeister 3 move. In other words, in order to ever get started, I need to make the diagram more complicated. I need to add crossings in order to do anything. And that's what I call a demon. So there are no obvious simplification moves. It's just a really, really bad projection of the knot, right? A really, really horrible projection. You might wonder whether they exist or not. It's not quite clear why such a thing should exist. In the end, the knot is trivial. If you believe my my subtitle, like knotting of cables, then probably you should believe that those things actually exist. They exist in real life in some sense. And yeah, of course, here's an example, maybe a more formal example. So this one here is called the culprit, and it's an unknot. And I show you here the sequence to undo it. It's not complete. It's not trivial. It's not trivial at all. So you need to undo it in quite a few steps. But this diagram itself, there is no way you can use the Reidemeister 3 move, a simplifying Reidemeister 2 move, or a simplifying Reidemeister 1 move. And as you can see, my first move here, I shouldn't say I stole this picture, links to some really cool papers down in the description. So all of these pictures are stolen from those papers. Anyway, so the first move here is a Reidemeister 2 move, which makes the diagram more complicated by adding crossings, right? And so you need to make this culprit knot more complicated in order to eventually undo it. And that's pretty mind-blowing in some sense, unless, of course, you, again, know my picture of knotting cables, and this shouldn't come as a big surprise. So knotting cables are exactly like that, actually. So you can always undo them, but it's certainly not trivial, and it's very annoying most of the time. Anyway, so this is kind of an example of a demon, and good question would be, Are there infinitely many of those? Or maybe this is just a fluke. Maybe this is the only one in some sense. Of course, it's not, but maybe it is. And the theorem is there are arbitrary complicated ones, actually. So this one is a little bit harder. So homework is to undo it. So this really is an unknot. So this is a really bad projection of the unknot. Yeah, good luck to undo it. And as I said, these guys are also usually really, really bad projections of unknots. So you shouldn't be surprised that this theorem holds, but it's still beautiful. So strictly speaking, it's just the following. For every n, you can find an even bigger n and demon shadow with that many crossings. In other words, demons get as complicated as you want. Right? Again, I said again, it's kind of very believable if you keep this picture in mind, but it's still pretty cool there. Well known for a long time. I'm not sure who proved that first. There is a proof in the paper in the linked in the description, which is constructive, meaning they produce an algorithm, or they give you an algorithm that produces infinitely many of those knots. And yeah, so this is kind of the classical question, knot theory. Shadows are very important. You can have arbitrary complicated shadows. You can beef this up. You can have arbitrary complicated shadows of arbitrary knots if you want. But the unknot is kind of the most important one. And then you would like to do better. You would like to ask different questions. For example, I start with my culprit. It has 10 crossings. Hope I haven't miscalculated. And I know that I need to make it more complicated, but how bad can it get? So can I find some measurement on the knot? The maximal number of crossings I need to pass through, and so on. As far as I can tell, all of these natural questions are pretty much widely open. So this is kind of the best theorem I found, again, linked in the literature. So there's some upper bound on the complexity of the knot that you need to factor through. And it's given by the following counting. So you count the number of maximums in your projection and take it times 2. And you count the number of crossings in your projection and call that number m, or whatever you want to call it. And then you need to at most these number of crossings, right? So you need at most m minus 2 squared crossings in order to simplify your daemon, right? You make it more complicated to definitely get more crossings, but you never need more than m squared minus 1, m minus 2 of squared crossings. Very complicated. But usually, and that's kind of, so it's really nice. It's just a counting. You count maxima, you count crossings, and you know that it never gets worse than a certain bound. But these bounds are usually, these bounds are usually very, very far from being optimal. So if I haven't miscalculated for the culprit, the bound gives, I at most need 324 crossings. But as you can see in those diagrams, I certainly don't need anything near 324 crossings. So this is again a nice theorem. The state of the arts in this direction, what is the unknotting problem, basically what's underlying here is just a very hard problem. And not much is known. Yeah, turns out that not really much is known, as I said. Link to this, again, to this paper here is really nice. It's linked in the description. Okay. One point I haven't mentioned so far is you can think of a kind of making this theorem stronger. I'm not sure about the status of the following wannabe theorem. So if you think about it a little bit, then the Reidemeister moves are kind of the minimal type of moves you need, but you could allow bigger moves, like compositions of Reidemeister moves, and you might wonder whether it's possible to define daemons with respect to those bigger moves. And the idea comes from the following. So if you take the culprit, and you actually think of it as an object in 3 space and not as a shadow, then it's pretty obvious that you can undo it. So it's actually not so hard to see. So you might wonder whether the Reidemeister moves are just a bad way of attacking the culprit, and some other form of kind of local moves are much better, and then it's actually not really a daemon with respect to those local moves. Well, as I said, I'm not sure about the status of this wannabe theorem that I'm going to state, but I kind of feel like there should be daemons for no matter what type of moves, local type of moves you choose. Basically, again, because cables knot themselves, and they're non-trivial, even in 3 space, as you all know. And, well, I don't know. As I said, I think this is pretty much open discussion. But anyway, so in this video, I presented you a weaker statement just focused on the Reidemeister moves. And in that case, it's actually not so hard to see that you have infinitely many of those demon knots, which I think is a cool statement. Although, again, with my little, well, I hope you liked it, which maybe, but probably you're just too young and you don't remember knotting things anymore because today everything is wireless, which is really good because I'm doing those cable knots as free. Anyway, so if you keep the cable knots in mind, the knotting of cables, it's kind of not surprising in some sense. It's still pretty cool. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I also hope to see you next time.